Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello guys, and welcome back to True Drew Podcast. Today, we're going to be jumping back into some of the Nancy Drew books for this episode. And for the last month or so, we've been talking about the 1970s Nancy Drew / Hardy Boys TV show. At some point later in the podcast, we'll cover season 2, but for now, we're going to jump into some of the Wanderer edition Nancy Drew books. Also, happy March. I hope you guys are having a good March so far. I'm kind of just stunned that we're already this far into 2025, but I actually just came back inside from attacking my front flower bed. There are weeds everywhere. Apparently, the only plants that I can keep alive are weeds and succulents. I mean, succulents kind of go without saying, like you only have to water them like once every week or so, or whenever you remember to. But I don't have a green thumb, and I don't know why I did this, because like I always regret doing any kind of landscaping around my house. Like, it looks good when I'm done, but I feel like my neighbors probably think that I'm crazy because I'll be out there with like tools of all kinds and just mumbling to myself and ripping weeds out of the soil, and I'm just like, this is not enjoyable in the least. So those of you that actually understand and enjoy plants, I salute you, because that's not me. I legitimately don't get it. But I threw in the trowel, as it were, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to go inside and do something that I actually enjoy, which is talk about Nancy Drew. So here we are, and we're going to be talking about the Triple Hoax mystery. This is the first paperback, I think, of the Wanderer editions that came after the original 56 books. This is book number 57, and it was first published in 1979. So a little bit of backstory on these Wanderer editions. The Wanderer editions of the Nancy Drew books were books 57 through 78. So these came out in like 1979 to about 1985. And then, of course, the Nancy Drew Files came out in the 80s, so they kind of were running simultaneously alongside this series. But if you are interested in some of this background stuff about these books, you can listen to one of my earlier episodes. I believe it's like episode 2. I was right. I just checked. It's episode 2, and it's kind of the mystery behind Carolyn Keene. And I talk a little bit about the Stratemeyer Syndicate, Harriet Stratemeyer, Mildred Wart Benson, who wrote a lot of the earlier books. And there was this big legal battle between Grosset and Dunlap, who originally published the books, and then Simon & Schuster, who published some of these Wanderer editions. So if you want to know more about that, you can listen to that episode. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these different cover editions that I was able to find for the Triple Hoax mystery. So I was able to find 4 separate editions for this cover. The first one is, of course, the Wanderer edition. The second and third are, I guess, updated covers from the 80s and 90s. And the fourth, I believe, is a UK edition. I've never seen this one before. So I have to say the first cover is definitely my favorite out of the 4. But the Wanderer editions marked this different kind of look to the Nancy Drew book covers. They look more like a window that you're looking through. And, you know, Nancy Drew is bold and on the front of the book, and the number of the mystery is in between her names. And there's just, it's very cool. It's very purple, and we've got Nancy wearing this pink floral dress, and she's kind of got her arms folded, and she's looking out at us. And in the background, you can see these purple curtains. There's a stage behind her, and what looks to be 3 magicians. And the majority of this mystery centers around those 3 magicians. They call themselves the Hoaxsters, and they scam people out of money and a lot of other personal assets. Also, I always say this in case somebody new is listening to the podcast and hasn't listened to previous episodes, but if you want to see these cover editions that I'm talking about, you can check out my Instagram, True Drew Podcast. I always like to post these book covers the day before the episodes air, so I post them on Wednesdays. So moving on to the second edition of this cover, we have Nancy, and she's wearing like these high-waisted khaki shorts that are kind of rolled up at the bottom, and a pink polo shirt. She's really given like late 80s, early 90s kind of country club chic, I guess is what you would call it. That's what it looks like to me. But she is standing beside the statue. There's a pyramid in the background, which I guess we can assume is Aztec or Mayan. because this mystery actually takes place in Mexico City, and there's a man that's kind of looking back at her. I think he's supposed to be Enzo Scorpio, who is one of the bad guys we deal with in this book. The third cover edition is kind of similar. We have Nancy again at these pyramids, and you can see the guy, I'm assuming Enzo Scorpio, kind of looking around the corner at her. But Nancy has shorter shorts on, and she's got like the crew socks, white tennis shoes, and she's kind of got the feathered hair. So I'm assuming this cover is later than the one that we just talked about. But it's funny because the tagline at the top says, "Danger awaits Nancy in a hot climate." And the fourth and final cover edition, which I have to say this is probably my least favorite of all four, just shows Nancy in this red circle. There's a bunch of flames behind her and a magician, and then a ransom note that says deliver, I can't even tell what that says, 100,000 something, ransom, however much it was in the book. But it's just, you know, Nancy wearing a chambray shirt and a sweater vest, and I don't know, it's just not as cool as the other three. So I came up with a funny cover spoof using the first book cover, and I said, just call me misdirection. Get it? Because misdirection, magician's term, we're dealing with magicians who are fraudulent. I don't know, I thought it was funny. So as far as giving these book covers a rating, I would give the first one 5 magnifying glasses. The next two I would give probably a 3, and the last one I would probably give a 1 because it just wasn't my favorite. And also, while we're talking about these different book covers, there's another interesting formatting difference to these Wanderer editions, some of these paperback books. In these earlier editions, there are a lot of illustrations in the books that are black and white, and they're very different from the earlier 56. I mean, you know, Nancy obviously in those looks like she's from the 40s, 50s, you know, 30s, depending on which editions you have. And these are just, I don't know, they kind of have like a comic book sort of quality to me. So now let's go ahead and discuss some of the characters that we encounter in the Triple Hoax mystery. So we've already mentioned this guy's name a couple times, and I feel like we just have to start with him, but Enzo Scorpio. Like, what kind of a name is that? I feel like I am in Harry Potter and I'm just saying Enzo Scorpio, like it's some kind of spell that I'm casting, or it sounds like it just reminds me of astrology. I'm just like, Enzo Scorpio, like, what a name. All I'm gonna say is props to the people that come up with the names for some of these bad guys, because you guys have me in stitches sometimes. I'm like, what? Nobody would have a name like this, ever. Another character that we encounter is Fernando Pedroa, who is a poison collector. There's also Annabella Richards, who is Aunt Eloise's friend. We're supposed to be helping her with this mystery. There's Trudy, who is Annabella's housekeeper, and Roscoe, who is Annabella's chauffeur. So we can infer from this, Annabella is well off. She's not hurting for that money. There's also another woman that Nancy ends up helping in this mystery, and her name is Rosa Mendez, and she's missing her granddaughter, who's named Dolores. And then there's a lot of aliases in this book, and you know how I feel about those, but there is Ronaldo Jensen, aka Horace Brown, Howie Barker, aka Ralph Rafferty, aka Sam Gambro, like just double aliases. But anyway, some of these are the hoaxster characters. So now I'll go ahead and read a quick synopsis for the Triple Hoax mystery. Aunt Eloise asks Nancy to help her friend Annabella Richards with a mystery. She was scammed out of money by a supposed travel agent after her husband died, but things only get stranger from there. The girls go to a magic show put on by the hoaxsters, and soon they start getting asked to invest in a fishy timeshare. Their mystery takes them to Mexico City, where they have to find a kidnapped child and stop the scam artists once and for all. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with is Abracadabra, Nancy Drew busts scam artist magicians and finds kidnapped child. So now we'll go ahead and jump into my direct quotes and notes. I took a ton for this one. So the first thing that I wrote down is a lot of Nancy's mysteries start with her and Carson talking at the breakfast table, and I find this to be so wholesome. Like, I can just picture them sitting there in the Drew household and asking each other to pass the salt, and then Carson being like, oh, so Nancy, I've got another mystery for you. But it turns out that Aunt Eloise has a case for Nancy this time. We haven't heard from her in a few books. So Nancy, Bess, and George jet off to New York to meet Aunt Eloise and her friend Annabella that needs their help, and they meet at the airport, and a man comes up to them and says Roscoe, the chauffeur, had car trouble, and he just tells them they need to get a taxi. Nancy. So they do, but Nancy is very suspicious, and she whispers to Annabella not to discuss the case because she's like, that's a little bit strange and convenient. Like, how did this guy know that Roscoe had car trouble, and how does he know who they are? And now he's telling them to get in a taxi. Like, it seems like the perfect opportunity to have somebody eavesdrop on them. So once they get somewhere safer where nobody can listen in on them, Annabella explains her story, and she says her husband, who was very charitable, passed away, and she was left to keep up donating to organizations, and it was just too much work for her, and she needed a vacation. And I just put, LOL. This just reeks of first world problems, like, I have too much money and I don't know how to donate it to all these poor unfortunate souls. It's too much work. I need to go on a vacation. Annabella is not even British. Like, that's just where my mind went. Like, it just seems like a very upper crust complaint to have. Like, I have too much money. These money bags are too heavy. I need to lighten them, but even that's too hard for me to do. Oh, the problems these people have that Nancy Drew ends up helping sometimes in these mysteries. Like, seriously. But anyways, this man claiming to be Henry Clark said he'd arrange her vacation for her because apparently she can't even do that. So she gave him $3,000 only for him to disappear, and all her arrangements were faked. Now that is a shame because nothing should get in between you and a vacation. Like, am I right? So that's kind of scary that she gave this guy $3,000 and he just disappeared. I don't know though. Is it just me? But like, I kind of tend to be more sympathetic to the characters that Nancy helps who are really down on their luck, who are poor, they don't have parents, I don't know. Like, in some of the earlier episodes, I think I talked about it and I was like, Nancy kind of comes across as this savior to people, but that's kind of why we like her at the same time. But I don't know. Some of these upper crust characters that have these quote unquote problems, like, I just find that they're so much less relatable, if that makes sense. But see, that's the difference between me and Nancy Drew. Like, Nancy Drew will help anybody no matter what, and I feel like I'm a little bit more judgmental of people sometimes. But hey, a mystery is a mystery at the end of the day, am I right? So Annabella has explained all of this to Nancy at Aunt Eloise's apartment, and Nancy is like, of course I'm going to help you. And Annabella takes this time to also call her housekeeper, Trudy, and she says that a man called and said Annabella would never see her car again, and she's worried about Roscoe, her chauffeur. Now, I've been pretty rough on Annabella for the last couple minutes, but she is more worried about Roscoe than her car, so I was like, okay. She just went up a couple points in my mind. So the next thing to happen in this book is Aunt Eloise takes the girls to a magic show put on by these three guys called the Hoaxsters. And Bess is scared of some of the acts, but then she volunteered, which I thought was kind of funny and out of character for her. I mean, honestly, I would expect that more from George because George loves to go and volunteer to do stuff. She's very athletic. She likes to be kind of the center of attention, but it was Bess this time. But also, we have to talk about this because these guys are called the Hoaxsters, and absolutely nobody was suspicious of them until Nancy comes along. And I find this funny because it's like, it's in their name. Like, it's almost like calling yourself the insurance fraud people or the embezzlers. It's like, you couldn't have held a bigger sign and been like, look right here at me, I'm a bad guy. But anyways, while Bess is up there on stage, the magicians take different items from the volunteers without them noticing, so they're just essentially pickpocketing them and using misdirection, and they reveal it, and then they say they'll give the items back after the show. So I think I may have mentioned this in a couple other places on the podcast, but my husband is a magician, so I'm very familiar with magic shows. I've been to several. I've been backstage to them. I've been an assistant in magic productions. I've been in a lot of trunks in my life, but if anybody ever does this to you at a magic show, like, you should definitely protest. It's like, no, give me back my stuff. It shouldn't be out of my sight at all. But it's very, very fishy, and Bess actually has her purse taken from her on stage. So George and I were on the exact same page about this because George wants to go up on stage and claim Bess's purse instead of waiting till the end of the show, but Nancy reminds her that Annabella Richards said everyone got their things back afterwards, so she keeps George from going up there. and she's the one who said they should see the show, so Nancy's like, it can't be that bad. I think Nancy is also feeling out the situation, though, because it seems like Annabella Richards' problems really started after she went to this magic show, because she had this travel agent approach her, and then he ran off with her money. So I think Nancy's already got the gears turning in her mind, and she thinks there's more to this magic show than meets the eye. So after the show, Bess starts going over the items in her purse, and she blushes and says she has a picture of Dave that she wouldn't want to lose for $1 million. I thought that was really sweet. But another thing that's definitely suspicious, the Hoaxsters troupe also makes all the volunteers who had their items taken during the show sign a release form saying they relieve them of any wrongdoing. That is such a red flag. Like, you may as well have said, I solemnly swear that I'm up to no good. And what happens but the very next day, Bess gets a call from some guy named Howie Barker, who is essentially trying to sell her a timeshare, which also, Bess is 18 years old. Like, I mean, she's a legal adult, but like, you're trying to sell her a timeshare? But Nancy tells Bess to tell him to come by because she's kind of wondering, you know, maybe this is part of the angle of their scheme, the Hoaxsters. So Bess tells this Howie Barker person to come by Aunt Eloise's apartment. And okay, can we talk about this? I love the fact that Aunt Eloise is just like, I'm going to work. And she lets the girls have this strange man over who could be a con man. Like, do we not see a problem with this? It really made me think of the Secrets Can Kill computer game where literally Nancy is solving a teenager's murder at a local high school and Aunt Eloise is nowhere to be found. It's just like, we go to her house, we go to the school, we go under the crime scene tape, and it's just like, there are no adults around whatsoever. But anyways, this Howie Barker guy comes over and he pitches this offer to Bess, and Nancy hides behind a wall screen so he doesn't know that she's there, and she takes pictures of him with this camera that she has, and she wonders if he might be the Henry Clark that Miss Richards talked about. I mean, that was a travel related fraud scheme. This timeshare is probably a travel related fraud scheme, you know, connecting the dots. So once the man leaves, Nancy and the girls take the photos to the police and they explain their suspicions, and the police say they'll keep an eye out. But Howie Barker knew all these creepy things about Bess. He knew that she'd stayed at a hotel in Maine, he knew about her savings account, and Nancy wonders if the Hoaxsters went through everyone's wallets and purses at the show and are now using personal information to scam them. So the girls go to show Annabella Richards the pictures of the man, Howie Barker, but she says Howie Barker doesn't look like the man she met. And she also takes them on a tour around her house where every room is decorated like another country. This woman is so extra. Like, literally, like, here's the bathroom, which is themed like Japan, and here's Italy. But it sounds like the themed rooms Elvis had at Graceland, like, but maybe less tacky. I don't know. But in the Italy room in Annabella's house, Nancy sees a mannequin in a soldier's uniform, and she finds a vial in one of the pockets in the uniform, and Annabella instantly just suspects that it's poison. I love how sometimes in these books we'll just jump to that conclusion, like it's poison or it's a bomb. So they take the vial to this guy named Mr. Horner, who's a chemical analyst, and his assistant, who is Enzo Scorpio, and they say it's poisonous mushrooms. And then Mr. Horner asks if Annabella wants to sell the poison, and she says no, and they recommend a poison expert in Washington, D.C. And Miss Richards also shows them some scammy letters that she received while Nancy and the girls are back at her house. So the next thing that happens in the book is when the girls go back to the magic show, George tries to volunteer to go up on stage, but they won't let her, and Nancy thinks it's because they recognize them. So in order for their scam or their fraud to work, they're trying to target as many people as they can, and they don't want them to be in the same social circles because obviously people talk. So they're obviously a little bit disappointed that they don't get another chance to see how the Hoaxsters' scheme is working. But when the girls talk to Trudy, Miss Richards' maid, later, she says, oh yeah, this man called asking about Nancy, and so Trudy told him that she was a detective. This is so dumb. I can't stand it when in the books, you know, there's always this side character and somebody calls them and they fish for information about Nancy, and then that person lets it slip that she's a detective. So it's like, not only did you just endanger Nancy, you endangered anyone else around her and the whole entire investigation. So Nancy, Bess, and George go to see another magic show, but the show has closed. And Nancy asks waitresses at a luncheonette counter across the street if they know where they could have gone, and one of them mentions that one of the hoaxers said something about Mexico City. So it looks like we're going to be doing some traveling pretty soon. The next note that I took down, Annabella calls Nancy and she's all upset because her poison, which she previously didn't know that she even had, went missing on the way to DC. And I mean, I get it, it's not good to misplace your poison because, you know, it could poison somebody. But wow, like TSA has changed so much. Like, I doubt they would let you through with toxic poisonous mushrooms now. Also, I'm assuming she just changed her mind because before she's like, nah, I don't want to sell this poison, I want to keep it. And now she's going to DC, so go figure. So it's while Nancy is on the phone with Miss Richards when she hears this gasp and a man comes on and says he'll take care of her, and then the line goes dead. So Nancy calls the DC police because she's in a panic. She thinks Miss Richards is being kidnapped or something. She doesn't know what's going on. But Miss Richards got worked up, fainted, and it was a grocery delivery man who answered the phone. I thought that this was going to be so much more sinister, and I honestly don't blame Nancy for calling the police, because if somebody comes onto the phone after the person you're talking to just goes, and then they're like, I'll take care of her, and then click, it's like, yeah, I would think the worst too. But also, bravo on that Instacart delivery guy for being like, I'll take care of her, it's okay. I know this book was written in 1979, but I enjoy mixing modern references into the books sometimes. So the girls are leaving to go see the police when a car follows and sideswipes their taxi, and Nancy has to call an ambulance for the taxi driver because he just passes out. And when the police show up, she gives the plate number of the other car that hit them, and of course, it's stolen. But the good news is the police have a lead on the pictures that Nancy took them of this Howie Barker character, and it turns out they've identified the man in the picture, and his name is Ralph Rafferty. So you see what I mean? Like, there's a lot of aliases in this book. So Nancy says that they need to go to Mexico City to follow some of these leads on the hoaxers, and it's funny because George says her detective allowance is getting low, and her dad asks why they don't all just go get paid to solve mysteries, and George says Mr. Drew wouldn't like that. It would take them out of the amateur detective class. I appreciated that they threw this in the book because I think a lot of the times when I talk to people on Instagram about the Nancy Drew books, they're like, how did Nancy afford to go on all these trips, and why doesn't she just get paid for her work? And I feel like this was kind of the author's attempt to explain, you know, well, they could get paid for their work, but then they would also be classified as a higher grade of detective, so maybe there's some legality issues that come with that. I don't know. So Nancy, Bess, and George go to stay at the Fortunato, which is this hotel in Mexico City, and the manager says the police want to talk to them. So they say that they got a tip saying the girls were practicing detectives without a license. So I guess that kind of explains it, and we can assume that the hoaxers are the ones that called that tip in, but I think, if I remember correctly, I feel like George gets really mad, and she's like, we're amateur detectives, we don't even get paid to do this stuff. So they sort all that mess out, and Nancy's like, no, we don't get paid to do this, we're just amateur detectives, it's fine, we don't need a license. And so then, after this happens, Aunt Eloise calls them, and she says the police think that Enzo Scorpio stole the poison from Annabella Richards. I guess when she took it in there to have it chemically analyzed, he saw it and he's like, oh, this looks like some good poison, I'm gonna pocket this and take it myself. While I was reading this entire book, I could not help but think about The Emperor's New Groove and how Kronk is like, oh, that poison. The poison for Cusco? Cusco's poison? So the girls are going to watch the hoaxers in Mexico City, and they decide to stop for shawls and dresses. So of course George has to fat shame Bess. She has to have any kind of opportunity that has to do with clothes. She has to be mean to Bess. But Bess says, if only I could find something to suit. And George says, your waist? Senora, do you carry chubby sizes? I'm sorry, but if I was Bess, I would take George to a hat store next, and I'd be like, hey, does anyone have a hat for someone with an insanely large head? My cousin. George is the worst. So everybody buys their clothes, and then they go to the magic show, and they meet a woman there named Rosa Mendez, who has family in Oaxaca. Now, we haven't talked about this game yet on the podcast, but The Secret of the Scarlet Hand, you knew what reference I was thinking of when Taylor Sinclair is like, you want some of these cookies? They're from Oaxaca. But Senora Mendez seems like a pretty nice person, but she goes up on stage to volunteer, and Nancy warns her the important papers in her purse could have been read by the hoaxsters. So unfortunately, Miss Mendez had some papers of a sensitive nature in her purse, which I don't think you should probably take those with you if you're going to a magic show, but sometimes it happens, you don't have time to run home, whatever. But Nancy is worried that she's going to be the next target of the hoaxsters. I mean, she's exactly their type. She's an older woman, she's well off, like the exact person that they like to target. So the next day, Senora Mendez takes Nancy, Bess, and George to the Pyramid of the Sun, and they're talking about the Aztec, and George says the Aztec were a highly intelligent and cultured people. And this reminds me of that audio on Instagram that's like, did you know that the ancient Egyptians believed? It kind of, again, made me think of the Scarlet Hand because a lot of this mystery takes place in Mexico. We're talking about the Aztec, and in that game and in that book, they talk about the Maya, so a lot of similarities. But while everybody's at the Pyramid of the Sun, they decide to go up the steps of the pyramid, and Bess helps an older woman who almost falls all the way down. She almost had a Henrik Vanderhoof moment. If you know, you know. But while they're there, they spot Enzo Scorpio, the poison thief, but he gets away. And then some random tourist guy asks Nancy if he should follow him, and she says no. Then he says, if you're after a handsome fellow, how about me? Like, that was not the pickup line that you thought it was, sir. So Nancy ends up talking to the police in Mexico, and she tells them about Enzo Scorpio, and they think he might try to sell the poison to some local guy, Fernando Pedroa, who apparently just collects poisons. I'm sorry, but as far as bizarre collections go, this is one of the most bizarre. Like, what? How can you just collect poisons? And the police say ordinarily he wouldn't be allowed to have them at his house, but we know he's trustworthy and gave him a special permit. I'm sorry, what? A poison permit? Are you kidding me? I mean, if you're on the government's watch list, if you're on their radar and you're like collecting a bunch of things that you shouldn't have, I mean, yeah, they gave him a permit, but like that seems like a red flag thing to me. Like, this guy has a lot of poison. What's he going to do with it? Oh, he's just going to enjoy it in a case with all these little vials? Like, no. What happens if the cleaning lady one day just bumps into one of the shelves and all the poison falls everywhere? Like, this just seems like a recipe for disaster. The only thing that seems more dangerous than this would be collecting live grenades. Like, the possibility that you could hurt yourself and hurt other people. Like, just because you like the pretty little bottles with the pretty little poisons inside of them, like, no. So anyway, Nancy gets a call from Senora Mendez, and her granddaughter was kidnapped, and she says, oh, why did the kidnappers have to pick my family? And I was like, okay, all kidnappings are bad. Like, I get it. Why did this have to happen to me today? But it's like, maybe you want to rephrase that. And also, we know why the kidnappers picked you. I mean, she doesn't know it up to this point, but it's like you went to this magic show, they targeted you because you have money. So Nancy, Bess, and George immediately go to the theater, and the hoaxsters have skipped town again. And there's a cleaning man that says that they shouldn't be poking around, and Nancy gets a painting smashed down over her head. So she puts two and two together, and she's like, I think it was the cleaning guy because he was being mean to me. So next, Nancy interrogates a maid at the theater who says some guys named Lefty and Howie visited the hoaxsters, Howie Barker. So she thinks they went to LA. And the very next thing to happen in the plot is Miss Mendez calls Nancy in a panic, and she has received a ransom note for $100,000 for Dolores, her granddaughter, to be safely returned. And Nancy notices the note was folded like a fan, and she breaks the code of every fifth word. So once the code is broken, it just says $100,000 in sack to 8 by X. So Nancy decides to mull that over, and Nancy, Bess, and George go to Sonora Clara's dress shop, and she starts talking about investing in some kind of fabric, and Nancy realizes that she was also a volunteer in the hoaxsters show and warns her that it's a scam. So the woman believes Nancy, and Nancy says, is this guy coming by your shop to talk to you about this? And she says yes. So the girls hide behind a door, and Howie Barker and someone named Mr. Caldwell come in and try try to pitch some kind of fabric called Silcosheen that can be worn all year round and regulates body temperatures. Sounds a little bit too good to be true, but she says that she isn't interested, and Barker spots Bess's wallet on the chair and realizes that they're not alone. So he flings the door open and finds the girls hiding there. And then he threatens them and basically is like, stay out of my business. So they run off, but the girls stop on their way to LA. They're driving from Mexico back into the United States. And they stop off and they eat some Mexican food, and George apparently can't take the heat of spicy peppers. So Bess teases her about this, and George claps back with, guess I deserve that for teasing you about your 40-inch waist. It's like, George, you were so close to some self-enlightenment there. But it gets a little bit worse because once they get back in the car, George makes this weird comment, and she says that Bess looks better than the stout Indian women that they saw. And I was like, this is so just bad. I was just like, seriously? And then Nancy comments that the younger people were attractive because they're not wrinkly. And I was like, wow, okay, so we're comparing ethnicities on a scale of attractiveness, and we're saying that old people are ugly. Like, why? These books are so unhinged for this. Also, if you're like me and you're wondering why Nancy Drew is driving her car back into the United States instead of just flying, because that's usually what she does, there's apparently an airstrike, so that's why they're doing that. So Nancy gets stopped at the border, and a Border Patrol agent says he got a tip that she was smuggling jade, and sure enough, there was a piece of jade in the trunk. So someone planted it there in order to get Nancy, Bess, and George stopped by Border Patrol. And Bess takes matters into her own hands, and she starts flirting with another Border Patrol agent. So she starts crying and she's like telling him what's going on, and they get in touch with this guy named Lieutenant Tara in Mexico City, and he vouches for them. It's just crazy. I mean, good on Bess, I guess, but I've always pictured the Border Patrol agents as being like the Queen's Guard in England, like, you know, they are very stoic and they're not going to break down for anybody. Now, once they get back to the States and they're in LA, George calls a family friend and they see if they can stay with them because all the hotels at the town they stopped in are full for a detective convention. I mean, that honestly kind of sounds like a really cool convention, but it is funny how a lot of times when Nancy and her friends are jet setting around the world, they always have friends that they can contact in all these different cities. But after George makes that phone call, they go back to the car and it's gone. It's just disappeared. And George is so mad because it got stolen right under a bunch of detectives' noses, because she's like, there's a detective convention in this town. What's happening here? I mean, if I had to guess, they're probably in the middle of a seminar. They're probably a little bit busy. But Nancy just so happens to find a poster for the Hoaxsters show nearby, so she knows that they're probably the ones that stole the car. And they find the car eventually in a parking lot of a theater. So odds are. And meanwhile, Senora Mendez takes this opportunity to talk to Nancy, and she says that she's gotten another ransom note for her granddaughter. So the next note that I have, the laundry room catches on fire at the Vetter's house. This is the Friends of George's where they're all staying, and Nancy finds out that someone claiming to be Dave called Bess's mom to get the address of where they're staying. So Bess's mom, apparently this person was very convincing. She thought it was Dave, and she told them where they were staying. These family members of the Clue Crew members, like, they need to start having like code words when they're getting calls on the phone so they know like they're actually talking to Dave or Bess or Nancy, just whoever. And it's at this point that Nancy hears from Senora Mendez again that Senor Pedroa, the poison collector, was contacted by someone named Osney about buying poison. And Osney is Enzo backwards, so it's probably Enzo Scorpio. So Nancy talks to the Mexican police and they work out this sting operation, and the police catch Enzo trying to sell Senor Pedroa this fake poison. So he was trying to sell him fake poison so he could keep the real poison? I don't know. Why does this man do any of the things that he does? So the next thing that happens in the plot is Nancy, Bess, and George end up going to this movie with the Vetters, and a car follows them there. So they lose the car, but later as they're leaving the theater, they spot Howie Barker and Mr. Caldwell, the same men who showed up in Sonora Clara's dress shop trying to sell her on this Silcosheen fabric. Now, Nancy talks to Senora Mendez again. They have a lot of phone calls because, of course, they're in LA now and she's back in Mexico City, but they learn from her that the ransom notes that she's getting have ferns on them. So Nancy decides that maybe she should follow that lead next. And it's about about this time that we have Ned, Bert, and Dave, like the surprise that they're coming. It's not really a surprise because they show up in a lot of the mysteries, but their plane gets hijacked. I think I figured it out. Nancy, Bess, and George are to boats as Ned, Bert, and Dave are to planes, because Nancy has so many boating accidents, and then the guys always have plane accidents. Like, I think in the Golden Pavilion mystery, The Secret of the Golden Pavilion, they get on a plane and it has plane trouble. It's just like, you guys shouldn't be on planes and Nancy shouldn't be in boats. So they learn that the plane has been hijacked while they're at the airport, but Nancy also spots one of the hoaxsters at the airport, so she disguises herself and she asks why he's there, and he says his wife is on the plane that was hijacked. Very suspicious. So Ned, Bert, and Dave land and they're unharmed, everything's fine, but apparently the hijackers wanted a ride to South America, so they just hijacked the plane and they were just like, take us to South America. But the guys remember this annoying woman that was on the plane, and Nancy assumes that's probably the wife of one of the hoaxsters, so they point her out to Nancy, and George goes up to talk to her, and this woman like flies into a rage. She starts asking if George is her husband's special friend and like slaps her in the face, and it's wild. Like, what in the world? But George does find out that Ronaldo Jensen is a stage name, and the sleight of hand man is actually named Horace Brown. So it's after George recovers from being slapped in the face that they are talking about the case, and Nancy's getting them all caught up on everything. And the guys think that the temperature-controlled fabric is hilarious, and so Nancy jokes with Ned, who's apparently majoring in science, that he could create something like that. So the next note that I took down has to do with the fern lead that Nancy got from Senora Mendez, and Bert gives Nancy a lead on this fern printing company. So Nancy calls them up and they tell her that they don't have that paper in stock, but Horace Brown has some, and they give her his address. This kind of seems like a breach of client confidentiality a little bit, like, I don't know. But who is Nancy to look some gift stationery in the mouth? So Ned disguises himself, and the next thing that happens is he volunteers at the hoaxster's show and gets pickpocketed, and Nancy dusts a piece of paper in the wallet, his wallet, for fingerprints, and the police say that these fingerprints match Sam Gambro, aka Horace Brown. So we're closing in on these so-called hoaxsters. The next note that I have down is Nancy and Ned sneak into Sam Gambro's house, aka Horace Brown, and they find Dolores, Senora Mendez's granddaughter that was kidnapped, but they get locked in, and Dolores says that the couple kidnapped her and gave her candy that made her sleepy, so it was probably laced with drugs. This is so messed up, but the police do come and they end up arresting the Browns, and they find the poison that was missing from Annabella Richards, and Dolores is returned to her grandmother, so we do get a happy ending. And then to top it all off, Nancy is also honored by the detectives at a luncheon for the detective conference. So now let's talk about the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the Triple Hoax mystery. So as much as I don't like aliases, they did a little better job explaining aliases in this book, I will say that. And this mystery made a lot of sense. I feel like it was a very believable scam. The fact that they were, maybe not the magic show part of it, but everything else, like, this seemed like something I could have seen on the news. And the things I didn't like, I just put scammers. I just don't like scammers. I know that, like, we have to have bad guys in order to have mysteries to solve sometimes when it comes to Nancy Drew's universe, but I still don't like scammers. And as far as giving this book a rating, I would give it a 3.5 magnifying glasses. It was a little bit better than a 3, but not quite as good as a 4. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. For next week's episode, which is episode 75, we're going to be talking about the flying saucer mystery. It sounded like I said flying salsa. I said flying saucer. I can't talk today. But if you like mysteries that involve alien spacecraft and people coming out of the woods just randomly, then you will really like this one. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.